So please welcome Dr. Geoffrey Hardy.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thanks to the Major Energy Users Council for the opportunity to speak today. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So as you've heard, nowadays I'm a researcher at Imperial College. I'm also a non-exec director of a company, Public Power Solutions, based in Swindon, so that's a renewable electricity developer and a waste company. And I'm a recovering energy regulator as well, as you've heard. So my research nowadays is related to my time at Ofgem, so I'm really interested in what the low-carbon future means for the UK, and I'm particularly interested in what new opportunities come out of that, what sort of businesses, particularly electricity utility businesses and other utility businesses, will operate, what is the regulatory environment and how does that give permission for innovation, and what do consumers, citizens, people, what is their role in that in the future? So in this presentation, I'm going to give you a global view to start with on what net zero carbon means, and then I'm going to bring that down to the UK. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the opportunities in pursuing net zero carbon and some of the barriers that we need to overcome along the way. And hopefully I'll do that in about the next 14 minutes. So that is me in the background in Thailand. And the point of that meeting was getting sign-off on what this report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, what the structure of that report would be. So that was the bit I was involved in my short term as head of science for Work Group 3 of the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So that report was asked for in Paris. So this is the science of that. And what that report is saying is a couple of things. One is we're already locked in to 1 degree of warming. There's nothing we can do about that in the short term. So what we're really talking about is how do you avoid the next 0.5 degrees? And what that really entails, according to the report that came out recently, is a couple of things. One is that global emissions need to come down by 45% by 2030, and they need to be effectively zero by 2050. And that's the harsh reality of it. That's what we're looking at. So as you can imagine, that implies really far-reaching consequences, a massive transition to energy, land, infrastructure, and industry. And as my colleague, Professor Jim Ski at Imperial puts it, the difference between 1.5 degrees and temperatures above that is it becomes not a question of this, or do that. It becomes a question of do this, and that, and that, and that, and faster. And that's what 1.5 degrees means. So let's come back to the UK. So in the UK, we already have a challenging carbon target to reduce our carbon emissions 80% by 2050 based on 1990 levels. However, I've just said that 80% isn't going to cut it by 2050. It needs to be approaching zero. And that's exactly what Claire Perry has asked the Committee on Climate Change in the UK to advise government on. And I suspect that that will become a new Climate Change Act target in due course. So if the hill is going to get steeper in the future, which net zero would imply, how are we doing against our target, which is less challenging at the moment? Well, the good news, I think, is that we're doing quite well. So in the report to Parliament last year, the Committee on Climate Change notes that we are down 43% on emissions compared to 1990. Or rather, compared to 1990 baseline. So we're doing well. And we've heard already this morning from some of our panellists that electricity has been driving the way on that. So emissions from electricity have come down, renewable percentage has gone up a lot. But there is a lot to do going forward. So if we're going to proceed to hit those targets, so on your right is a graph that the Committee on Climate Change put out, and what that's doing is showing how we're doing against the targets in the 2020s to 2030s. So this is the fourth and fifth carbon budgets, which are a bit tougher than other ones. So just to help you read that graph, in amber is basically where the Committee on Climate Change feel there is a policy in place and there is a chance of it succeeding. In red, that's where the Committee on Climate Change feels there is a policy in place, but they have no confidence it's going to achieve the emissions that will be required. And in the dashed line, there is no policy in place to achieve those emission cuts. So there is a big red gap in there. And what the Committee on Climate Change is asking for is much more certainty on future policy to fill that gap, a strategy, particularly on heat and transport and industrial energy efficiency, for example, and industrial decarbonisation, and then optionality. They're asking for the UK to start exploring some of those options that give breathing space, like carbon capture and storage, like floating wind turbines, and that kind of thing, which have some development to go. So I'm sure that you've seen, my things stop working, that's better. I'm sure that you've seen in that report, for those who've read it, that there are recommendations specifically for industry, and these really break down into two things. One is energy efficiency, and the second is to support industrial decarbonisation. So these are recommendations to government that they should do something about it this year. So they should publish some forward plans, something that's going to be helpful. There are a tranche of other recommendations on heat, transport, electricity, agriculture, etc. in there. But this is hopefully what you might see coming out of the back end of this report this year. So, now, there is a policy gap. But I'm sure anyone who's involved in policy in your organisations doesn't feel that there's a deficit of policies to respond to at the moment. It's a busy time, and I'm sure your colleagues are bemoaning the fact that there is consultation after consultation at the moment, and some of them are almost unintelligible, like the targeted charging review. So there has been all sorts of announcements in recent times. So off the back of the cost of energy review from Dieter Helm, last year's speaker, Greg Clark put out a speech where he killed off the trilemma and replaced it with the 4 principles. And his 4 principles are basically competition first, government needs to provide assurance and insurance to give people confidence to go forwards, regulation needs to become far more agile if we're going to capture the benefits of smart digital economy, and there should be no free-riding principle, and that is exactly what the TCR, the Targeted Charging Review, is trying to address, but there are quite a few reasonable objections, I think, to the way it's going at the moment. There are also a number of industrial strategy projects going on, and some that I'm involved in are these smart local energy system demonstrators, which are seeking in 4 different places to demonstrate what a future smart local energy system could look like and how that could help with decarbonisation. And the bit that I'm doing in a new research consortium called the Energy Revolution Research Consortium, easy to say, is to basically link the new evidence coming out of those demonstrators and bring that direct to policymakers and regulators to say, here is what you need in order to take a decision that will support that kind of future. That's really what I'm doing. Alongside that, Ofgem has been terrifically busy. Targeted charging review, forward charging review, review of the future retail market arrangements. They're also allowing quite a lot of playtime in the regulatory sandbox. So they're allowing businesses to try out new things with limited space within the regulatory framework to try those out. So it's a busy time. It might not be commensurate with a zero carbon future, though. But if it's busy now, in the future, it's going to be very, very busy indeed. Because if you look ahead to what scenarios like National Grid's future energy scenarios are saying the energy landscape of the future is going to be like, it is completely different from today. So scenarios commensurate with an 80% target, not a net zero target, but an 80% target, by 2050 show that perhaps up to 65% of electricity generation is going to be local, up from 30% today, that there could be up to 35 million electric vehicles of one form or another on the road, and we've all seen probably recently that hydrogen is making a comeback in various guises, so that could be taking part of, in some of the other transportation. And perhaps up to 20 million new sorts of heating devices in businesses and homes, and a lot of those are going to be electric. But perhaps the most dramatic change in this is the global rise in connected devices. So we are going to go from something like 15 billion connected devices globally to about 75 billion by 2025. So that's about 10 each per person on the planet, give or take. But of course, it's going to be more than that per person in this country, for example. Now, the interesting thing about connected devices is it means that they can transmit information and receive information and do something about it. And what we've heard time and time again from government, from others, and particularly from my colleague Goran Strabak at Imperial College, who does most of the analysis behind these numbers, is the way in which you can build the most cost-effective, low-carbon energy system of the future is if you do it in a very smart, optimized, and efficient way. The savings are manifest, so it's either 8 billion per year saving by 2030 if you listen to the National Infrastructure Commission, or a total saving of up to £40 billion by 2050 if you listen to the Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan from Ofgem. But it's Goran Strabak who's done the modelling for both of those. What he actually says is the net benefit is about £2.5 billion a year once you take out the costs of doing flexibility. But really that means bringing the demand side on parity with the supply side in energy. So that means being able to be very flexible in demand so you don't have to build more supply, but you can defer network investment, that you can do things in a much more optimal way, because that way you can increase the utility of the renewables available, you can stop having to build so much backup generation, and you can stop having to build quite so much network infrastructure. That's really where the costs come out of that. Now, I talked about costs there, but actually, this low-carbon future is a massive opportunity. So we've done some work with ourselves at Imperial College and some colleagues at Leeds University, and we've looked at the size of the prize for future utilities, but this could well be a size of the prize for future I&C consumers as well, customers as well, because we think there's up to £21 billion of new value available to utilities per year by 2050, and of course that scales over time between now and then, and this is based on things like National Grid's future energy scenarios. And just to pull out a couple of things from this, one is one of the most stable sources of revenue available is something around service provision, and really that's electric vehicle service provision, putting electricity into batteries, car leasing, infrastructure costs, all of that kind of thing. There is a big opportunity there because all scenarios show a very electric vehicle future. Now, what we've also done is we've spent some time thinking about what business models can capture that value. And we've considered the traditional electricity utility. We've thought about energy as a service, so selling warmth or comfort instead of kilowatt hours, peer-to-peer energy, and also bundling many more services together into contracts and realizing efficiencies between them. What we've done on top of that is we've figured out if there's a market for those. So we've looked at the consumers. We've surveyed consumers and asked them whether they want any of these new business models. And the good news is there is a consumer market for all of the business models we looked at, but after a utility, a traditional utility, which people recognise and know, the next most popular choice with a quite significant market was peer-to-peer energy. And when we looked into why that was, it turns out there's a segment of consumers who don't trust anyone at all, and they want to do it themselves. And there's a real driving force behind that. I don't know what way they'll have voted in the recent referendum, but you can imagine that there's a very low trust in everyone, including the police, from that particular group. But there is a market for these new business models. So a lot of the things that I spend my time on is thinking about how can these new business models get to market. So it could be a new utility model, it could be a new way of doing business as an industrial and commercial organisation. The key problem we come up with at the moment is like innovative business models can't get to market, and the reason is on your left, that regulatory and institutional spaghetti. That is the electricity institutional relationships. It's a brilliant bit of work by Exeter University, and I think there's only two things to take from that. One is it's very complex, as I'm sure you know as energy managers, and the second thing is it's incredibly prescriptive. So basically, if you take it onto my much more simple analogy on the right-hand side of that slide, if you come to the energy sector, say as a peer-to-peer company represented by a beetle, or an energy as a service company represented by an owl, by the time you get through the system, rules and regulation, when you come out of the bottom, all of that prescription basically turns you into the same thing. It turns you into a dog, because it's the only thing you can actually do once you're in that system. And if you look at all of the today's suppliers, they're all the same business model. I've just done a bit of analysis with Exeter University. You can read it online. They're all doing the same thing. The proposition is exactly the same underlying the business model, no matter what they actually say they're trying to do. So, what can we do about that? So on the back of the work I talked about the size of the prize for future utilities, we went out and we ran workshops with businesses in the UK, in Germany, and in the US. And we were asking them, what would you need, what decisions would you need to get taken in order to access that value? And across those workshops, there was staggering amounts of commonality. So it boiled down to 5 top priorities. The first one is a transparent commitment to carbon pricing, because you need that long-term future certainty on carbon price to drive investment decisions. The second is a clear strategy on transport, which we have a little bit of, and heat, which we have absolutely zero of at the moment. How are you going to decarbonise those 2 aspects of our infrastructure? The third is on how do you control consumer risk. So if you're going to bring innovative business models to market, there will have to be lots of thinking about consumer protection within that, because as innovation goes on, there could be unexpected harm to consumers. The fourth is that you need a reformed regulatory framework across the supply chain, and that really means something much more agile and less prescriptive than today. Principles-based was the word that kept coming back in those workshops. And finally, you need a platform that allows new energy services to emerge. And that's really, in the first instance, talking about unlocking flexibility. So that demand side in the first instance, but also some of these wider energy service provisions in there. So my final slide, some of you may have seen a report that we put out in December last year, launched at Parliament, led by Laura Sands, an ex-Conservative MP, and colleagues from Imperial College, including myself. And this report was, how do you reshape and redesign the UK regulatory framework to allow the potential of a decarbonised, decentralised and digitalised future to be unlocked? So what we, boiling down, a not too long report actually, it's quite an easy read, we boiled it down to 6 recommendations. So I'm going to go through these super quick and then I'll stop. So the first one is we need to change what we regulate. And we think that we need to normalise somehow the electricity sector compared with other supply chains. At the moment, the retailer, the supplier in the middle, has very limited ability to influence the supply chain either side of it, because there's so much prescription in there, so much fixed cost, etc. So we think there should be a way of allowing that retailer to act on behalf of consumers, to unlock demand side and supply side options, and to act much more like a retailer in that space. Secondly, we think we need to change how we regulate. So I think we need to move away from process and prescriptive regulation to risk regulation. The third is we need to protect and serve consumers better. And we think because there is likely to be increasing bundling of products together in the future, energy, entertainment, telecoms, etc., we think there is a good case to bring together the consumer protection elements of the different regulators to put together a single essential services consumer protection regulator. The fourth is that we think we need to open up the market to retailers, not energy suppliers. And what that means, we think, is instead of a supply license, you put in place an insurance-backed assurance process. Simply put, what happens in that instance is the retailer comes to the regulator and says, I am going to do these activities, and this is the harm, potential harm I could cause if I fell over to my consumers, the energy system, everything else that's relevant, and that informs the basis of your insurance premium. That is what he's going to pay for if you fall over, rather than lodging collateral as you do at the moment. And what that does is 2 things. One is it allows you to price a new and riskier model, but allow that price of insurance premium to come down over time as it gets market kind of like knowledge and experience. And the second thing is it allows you to assess how good a business is. And obviously we've seen a lot of suppliers going out of business. I think it's about 10 so far in 2018 and the start of 2019. Give or take. So it allows you to actually look at the kind of like the worthiness, the readiness of that business itself. Our fifth is that we need to optimize the system, and that really is a data-driven aspect. So we think that if the data is available, you can optimize the energy system much better. And what that means to me is to be able to build the smallest energy system possible to meet future demand. Because you know with far more granularity exactly what's happening on the consumer side, on the supply side, and in the system itself. And for that, we think we need to have energy data presumed a public good, unless there is a good proprietary or commercial reason why it shouldn't be. And then finally, we need to get more from less. And that's exactly what I just said. So we need to create a level playing field between demand and supply side. And we need to have an idea that building something that might not be necessary in the future should be a last option in this. You should be looking for ways of not building something in the first place, be it infrastructure, be it a power station, be it anything else. So it shouldn't be anything too controversial in there. That's all I wanted to say this morning. So thank you all very much for listening. Happy to take questions and on the panel later.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Well, you covered a lot of ground there. Dare I say, have you run your ideas past your previous employer?
Passed off, Jem. Yes, we have indeed. In fact, if anyone saw Mary Stark, who's the Director of Consumers and Retail Markets, in a blog she put out yesterday, she cited our report and our call for a managed revolution. Okay, good. You're going to be on the panel this afternoon, thank you, so there'll be more time for questions then. But does anyone have a burning question? Ah, yes, our friend Martin here.
Martin Young, ZTP. If we get a change of government with a nationalisation agenda, what do you think that will do to hitting the carbon targets?
Oh, no, that's a good question, Martin.
I would add, Jeff, that might be one of the questions that might come up this afternoon.
It does. So I'll give you my unconsidered answer now, and then I'll have a better consider over the lunch break. So it can do several things, can't it? So one is it could give much more certainty, the ability to tell aspects of an industry to do stuff in line with carbon targets can be quite helpful. What it does on costs, competitiveness, other sides of things, I think that really depends on how it's done. So cost of energy in the future, I honestly don't know what that would mean. And in terms of providing services to consumers commensurate with the sort of system we're going to have in the future, compared with the sort of system we have now, where really what you're asking in the future is consumers to radically change their heating systems, their mobility choices, all sorts of things. I don't know whether it makes it easier or harder on that side of things, because there are some business models that work very well in a competitive market that look like they're good bets for that sort of thing. I don't know how that would look under a nationalised or semi-nationalised industry.
If you could think about that over lunch, maybe you might have a clearer view by this afternoon.
Yeah, I'll have a think.
Thank you, Jeff.